It is great to be here at this luncheon. Great to honor A.G. Rhodes. I've heard a lot about you. I've worked with Deke and Al in the past year, and I have heard about your storied history, over 110 years of providing high-quality care for many of the elders in the Atlanta area. And so it's great to be here speaking with you. I don't think when I started as a GP many years ago that I ever expected that I would be doing this kind of thing. And I'll give you a little bit of a history of how I got from there to where I am now. But you might ask, if A.G. Rhodes has done so well and has such a great history and so many caring, compassionate people, they're entering into some transformative changes. And you might ask, well, why do that? Why rock the boat? If it isn't broke, why fix it? And I think that what A.G. Rhodes is doing is very good, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, when I think about change, I often think about a favorite quote of mine. It came from an Italian novel called The Leopard by Giuseppe di Lampedusa. And the quote is, if we want things to stay as they are, then things will have to change. I love that quote. It sounds nonsensical, but it is the reality, because the world is changing. It's the only constant. And so no matter what we're doing in elder care, aging demographics are changing, regulations are changing, reimbursement models are changing, competition is changing, politics are changing. And so standing still is not an option for anybody. And that's one reason why I applaud you for what you're embarking on. The other reason is that the name of this luncheon is Living Well. And I think that what I've found in my work in long-term care is that many, many older people are well cared for, but maybe are not living as well as they could. And so that leads me to explain a little bit about how I got here. Oops, I lost my, okay, I guess I gotta be careful. Okay. Explain about how I got here and what my journey has been as far as discovering what living well might mean. I started out as an internist in private practice. It was all I thought I was ever going to do. But after about 7 years, I got lured into the world of nursing home medicine. In Rochester, there are some very large nursing home communities with hundreds of people living in multi-story buildings. And a couple so large that they actually had a full-time medical staff. And I went to one of those and worked there for a little over 8 years. Became a geriatrician and felt we gave the best medical care on the planet. And that's probably about the time after I'd done that for about 6 years, I discovered this whole culture change movement. And the way I did was I went to hear a woman named Susan Burtis speak, and she had left her job as a DON of a very well thought of nursing home to become a full-time educator for a new movement called the Eden Alternative. And back then our knowledge of Eden Alternative was, oh yeah, it's about having dogs and cats in your nursing home. And so I went to hear the talk to figure out how you could have a dog in your nursing home and not have people fall down or have birds there and not get infected. And I was actually surprised that she didn't talk about those things at all. And she talked about all the things that we don't do in spite of trying to care our best for people living with dementia. And it made me realize that there's still a lot of plagues of being institutionalized in our country. And so I went down that road. I met the founder, Dr. Bill Thomas, spent a week with him, got the training for Eden, and started talking about it, and couldn't get my home to go down that path to change. They felt, like a lot of people do, we're doing well, why rock the boat? So I did something a little bit unorthodox at that point, because once the door was open, I couldn't close it again. So I gave my notice, and I started looking around town to see if I could find somebody else who would do this. Ended up at a large nursing home community across town called St. John's Home. And that's where I've worked for about 13 and a half years. And at that, we were able to actually not only go down that culture change pathway, we were able to register as we still are. I say we, I haven't been there for a few years, but they still are the largest freestanding Eden Eden Alternative registered nursing home in the entire world. And we also opened a couple of greenhouse homes using the small house greenhouse model. So I had experience with that as well. But somewhere along the line, I began more concerned about the way we are caring for people living with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. It was quite common, it's still unfortunately quite common when people become distressed to medicate them with drugs like antipsychotic drugs, drugs that were developed for people with schizophrenia and other psychiatric disorders. And I used them too. I never used them nearly as much as most people were because I was always very concerned about the side effects. And I found that, like many people, if people were upset, I could make them quieter with the medication. But I never saw the kind of quiet I wanted to see. I never saw people that looked relaxed or engaged or really enjoying themselves. And so I was always limiting my use of this. And this, as I look back, probably goes back 20 years or more, that I was being very cautious about these drugs. And it was about 10 or 12 years ago at St. John's that I began to speak out against the use of these and really dig my feet in. When the nurses would call me for prescriptions, say, no, I'm not going to prescribe that drug right now. Let's have a team meeting. Let's sit down. Let's talk about this person. Let's figure out what else we can do. Got a lot of pushback, as you can imagine. And this was at a time when nobody was really talking about potential side effects of these medications. The medical studies were still saying, yes, these drugs are safe and effective for use in dementia. We had a new generation of drugs that were supposed to be safer than the old generation. And at that time, probably if you had a diagnosis of dementia in a nursing home, probably 35 to 40% of people were getting one of these drugs. Even at that time, I was only prescribing it to maybe 5 to 6%. But I couldn't explain why. I just knew that I didn't like what these drugs were doing. Well, I got a lot of pushback. I actually got criticized by the medical director who felt I was under-medicating, even though nobody came to great harm as a result of it. But I began to realize that I had to explain my position. And I didn't really know exactly how to say what I didn't like or what to do differently. And I discovered something about 10 years ago, and that is if you don't understand something very well, maybe the best thing to do is to write a book about it. So I proceeded to start writing my thoughts down, and those thoughts became a book. I was still practicing full time. And once again, I'm not a researcher. I'm not a specialist other than geriatrics. I didn't have any specialized training in dementia. I was just using the same framework I learned with culture change, which is, in the early days, people like the Eden Alternative were told this is the way long-term care has to be. And they said, no, it doesn't. It can be different. And so I said, okay, how can dementia be different? So I started by looking at my own profession, what I've been trained, challenging myself, saying, are these drugs doing things that I don't realize they're doing? And I read the studies, something I'd never done, very carefully and critically, and found that really the science wasn't very good behind these. And so I just began making it up as I went along, trying to figure out a different way. So it really was just about taking a very old illness and turning it around and saying, how can I see this differently? And that led to me coming up with a new way to look at dementia and how to support people living with dementia, and led to finally when and my first book came out 7 years ago this month, actually, Dementia Beyond Drugs. And it got some nice notice when it first came out. Didn't fly off the shelves, but within a couple of years, then all of a sudden the media and the federal government were talking about antipsychotics and the dangers of these drugs. And all of a sudden, here's a guy with a book and who may come up with a seminar. And I got real popular. And I slowly evolved away from day-to-day practice to being a teacher and going out and giving seminars and lectures and helping with organizational change to help provide better care for people. And so that's what I've been doing now full-time for the past nearly 4 years, is just traveling around and speaking. And with this new position at Schlegel that Al talked about, a great opportunity to collaborate with formal researchers and with a very good forward-thinking organization with 19 retirement villages to start to put some evidence behind the things we're doing. But I want to just talk about what I have come to see as far as what dementia is all about. And there are really 3 pillars that I've evolved to my view and my approach. And it's going to come back to the whole living well theme. The first one is to get beyond just looking at the neurobiology of dementia. I think what's happened is we have become so focused on the neurobiology of dementia that we have lost sight of the person experiencing those changes. We could have 300 people in this room who all have Alzheimer's disease. You could all have the same stage or cognitive score. You could all have the same plaques and tangles in your brains, and yet no two of you are going to be alike as far as how you experience it, how you express it, how you cope with those changes. And I realized that we were missing that. We were starting to just see disease and not see people. And we were starting to pathologize things that any of us might feel if we were in a similar situation, even without dementia. And so we start blaming things on the disease. So if somebody becomes upset and cries out during a shower or strikes out at their caregiver, all of a sudden it becomes a symptom of dementia and needs medication. And I could do an experiment right now where I could just pair you off with whoever's sitting next to you, and I could say, we're going to have a fun little experiment. You're going to go away to a shower room and your partner's going to strip you naked and give you a bath. How many people would find that an easy experience? Okay, do you have a symptom of dementia, or is it just difficult to be stripped naked and given the bath? Now, obviously, dementia is a real illness, and I would never claim it isn't. And it's what I call an enabler of distress. It can affect your memory. It can affect your coping skills, your communication skills. You might not react the same way in that situation if you had dementia as you or I would, but it's not the root cause of the distress. It was the whole interaction that was the root cause. And by blaming it, we actually create a slippery slope to using potentially dangerous medications. So I realized we had to understand the experience of the person. And my greatest teachers, the people I met about 10 years ago to guide me on my way, and the people who I'm embarrassed to say, as a physician for 30 years, I didn't pay enough attention to, are the true experts on dementia. And those are the people who live with the diagnosis. There's nothing you can do. You can put earplugs in and Vaseline on your glasses and get pushed around in a wheelchair, but it's not the same as having your brain work a little differently and not processing information the way you used to. And so why not go to the people who experience that and understand what they have experienced? And I think one of my greatest teachers, the late Dr. Richard Taylor, with whom I've spoken here a few times at the Culture Change Network of Georgia, was one who was great at that. He used to get up and say, you know, one night I was sleeping in my bed and Dr. Alzheimer sneaked into my bedroom and he pulled out my PC processor and he stuck a Mac in there. And it's still working, but I just can't quite figure out how to make it make sense. And I think things like that gave me great insights. The other thing Richard said that really led me to see dementia differently was he said, I'm not dying of a fatal disease. I'm living with a chronic disability. And the mindset changed, not only focusing on living instead of dying, but seeing dementia as a disability instead of just purely disease helps you understand that there are more possibilities for people. Because our goal with disabilities is not to help people live longer or slow their decline. They're actually much higher goals. And I began thinking of people in wheelchairs who have physical disabilities and how we build ramps for them so that they can come into a place like this beautiful club and continue to engage and not have to walk up a flight of steps. And I started thinking, well, what are the ramps we can build for people with dementia? These aren't wheelchair ramps. They're cognitive ramps. How do we take people whose experience is changing and start to create a pathway so that they can continue to engage with the world in the way they're able to and succeed? Because we don't do that. It doesn't matter whether you live in your own house or in a nursing home. We take people whose experience is changing and we make them conform to our view of the world, our schedules, our rhythms, our staffing needs. And if they can't, we blame their dementia and medicate them. And that would be like asking a man in a wheelchair to walk up a flight of steps, and if he can't do it and gets upset about it, saying he's got a behavior problem. That's what we do with dementia all the time. And so the first pillar of my approach is to redefine dementia, not just as biology, but in a much more fuzzy way. So my definition of dementia that I arrived at in my first book is dementia is a shift in the way a person experiences the world around her or him. I'm not experiencing the world the way I used to. And sure, there's diseased brain in there, but this tells us to focus on how that person is experiencing that disease and not just focus on the plaques and tangles or Lewy bodies, but say, what does this person need to succeed? How can we focus on this unique experience? And to listen to the voices of the people who have this experience and pay close attention. I even learned that when I didn't understand what people were saying, when it seemed nonsensical to me, that there was a message there that I wasn't getting. And I've learned a lot about communication and understanding just by being open to those things that I'd never known before. The second pillar gets back to living well. The second pillar is that our main goal has been to mitigate decline. It's been problem focused. And I've decided to take a more appreciative approach. It took me a long time to get into this appreciative inquiry thing. I've always been a problem solver, and I could never believe when an organization said, we're going to focus on our strengths instead of our difficulties, and our problems will be solved that way. It took me a long time to trust in that process. But I realized that it was never about antipsychotics or any other medication. They were only a symptom of a system that was not trained at helping people live well. Living well is really important, and it's more than just good medical and nursing care. There's so many homes in the country that are so good at doing that, and yet a nursing home is a place where most of us would not choose to live, given the choice. It's still the place of last resort. My former CEO, Charlie Rundin, used to always say to people, we work with a product that nobody wants to buy. That's our job, is to sell a product that nobody wants to buy. And So I began looking at what's deeper than just good medical care, good nursing care. What are the other things we all need? And I started looking into the concept of well-being, which can equate to living well, I think. And there are many models out there, but I settled on one, and Adrian's been nice enough to put this picture up on the board for you. And a group of culture change specialists were commissioned by the Eden Alternative about 12 years ago to go beyond the usual quality of care measures, which are important but not complete, and say what else do people need. And they came up with these 7 what they call domains of well-being. They had them in a different order. I've since changed the order and put them in a pyramid. And I'll explain that to you in a moment. But the 7 domains they came up with were identity, connectedness, security, autonomy, meaning, growth, and joy. And the nice thing about these is that these are fairly universal. I think you can argue that across ages, across cultures, across nationalities, ethnicities, and across abilities, these are important to everybody. And if I asked you what gives you a sense of well-being, you'd come up with a whole list of things, and I could probably put them into one or more of these buckets. So if it's family, that could be connectedness, it could be security, it could be joy. If it's your faith, it could be meaning, it could be joy, it could be security, it could be identity. There's so many things that are important to us. But here's the thing that I discovered as I started working with this. And this was the core of my second book, and this is where my eyes really started to be opened when I started working with the second idea. How do we stop just trying to slow decline, but actually create well-being for people? Because people with dementia have often lost it. They've lost it for 2 reasons. Number 1, because of their illness. And number 2, because of the care systems that don't see the importance of living well for people. And I realized that the reason most people say they don't want to go to a nursing home is not because you don't have the most amazing people working there. Not because you don't have great doctors and nurses and aides and social workers and therapists creating the best care you can. But the reason is that because none of us in our professional training, doctor, social worker, therapist, CNA, nurse, none of us has ever been taught how to bring these to people. And when you move into long-term care, what often happens is you get great care of the body, but you leave these things at the door. And so what's missing? And how can we restore that? And as I began working with this, I said, okay, I'm going to write a second book, and it's going to talk about each of these domains. What is it? How is it challenged by dementia? How is it challenged by our care systems? And how can we use transformational approaches to help restore this to people who have lost it? I put these in a pyramid. If you've done psychology, sort of like Maslow's hierarchy, I call this Maslow's hierarchy. It's my own pyramid with the 7 domains. And I put identity and connectedness on the bottom. To me, this is the root. If you want to improve someone's well-being, they cannot be a stranger. You need to know them, and you need to have a relationship with them. So that goes on the base of my pyramid. This doesn't suggest that some domains are more important than others, but if you want to create well-being, I think there's a logical path. And I think that's where you start. Security. Now, Maslow had safety and food and shelter on the bottom of his pyramid, but I put security up there because security in this case is more than just physical safety. It's also emotional security. So it's trust, it's familiarity, it's dignity, it's privacy, it's balance. And once again, you need the relationship in order to maximize those. And then when you know the person and they have familiarity with you and you can negotiate risks to enable choice, then you can create autonomy, which can give you meaning, growth, and that it can all lead to joy, or joy can be a standalone domain. But there's nothing here that any pill will ever help. You will never have a pill that gives you more choice and control in your life, that makes you feel safe or secure, that helps you do anything that gives you a sense of meaning or accomplishment. I'm going to check my long-windedness here and see how we're doing. Okay, we're doing great. I do want to go through these 3 pillars, and I want to give you a story to show a real-life example of how you can take these kind of fuzzy, squishy things and actually make them happen, and how you can affect a lot of outcomes. The big revelation I had when I introduced this second part and started thinking about it and started teasing it out in my writings and my teaching was a revelation I'd never had before, because there's a certain number of people living with dementia who have distress or other expressions we just can't seem to figure out. And I think the reason that we're still giving close to 1/4 of people with dementia in nursing homes antipsychotics is because we have not figured out how to meet their needs. We have not figured out what it is that's causing their distress. And I might just make a comment here, because I've talked a lot about the nursing home medication initiative. The available research we have, and there's not much, the biggest study came out of the government of 1 million Medicare beneficiaries a couple of years ago. The best evidence we have is that there are many, many more people with dementia taking these potentially dangerous drugs in the community than there are in nursing homes. Because 4 out of 5 people with dementia probably still live outside nursing homes. And probably a fair number of them, maybe 2 to 3 times as many, are getting antipsychotics at home. They're not approved for dementia, so we can't count that very easily. But the studies we have show that it's very significant. So it's not a nursing home problem. It's a paradigm. It's a societal view of what dementia is and how we approach it. So while the media and the government are focused on nursing homes, and I think it's right for them to be, it bothers me that there's this big gap. There's no media campaign, there's no government education campaign to teach people in the community about the dangers of these medications as well. But it occurred to me that maybe the majority of people who are distressed, who we can't figure out, actually are distressed because one or more of these domains of well-being has become eroded by their illness, by the system of care. And if none of us has ever been taught how to restore these, it shouldn't surprise anybody that some people remain distressed even though we have, quote, done everything we can think of to help them. And so I created another approach which actually focuses on looking at people who are considered challenging and looking at where they stand with these 7 domains of well-being in their life at this time. Putting it as 7 drinking glasses and saying, how full is this person's identity glass right now? His security glass, his meaning glass. And then instead of just trying to fix the behavior, which is what we've been taught to do for decades, just ignore it and turn around and start filling those glasses 24/7. And I've had amazing results of people have literally fought with for months or years, who change because they're giving them what was really needed in the first place, which was living well, a path to well-being. And I've worked with homes who have not only reduced antipsychotics, even eliminated them completely from the people living with dementia. And we're not talking about a for-profit place that cherry picks its residents. We're talking about places that have 50-year-old buildings with double and quad rooms, unionized staff, lots of people on Medicaid, all the things that you think make it hard to change your approach to care. So this has been quite a revelation for me. Oops, looks like I've fallen to the floor. This may be my timer. Oops, I'm really causing trouble here. So that's first 2 pillars, looking at the experience. Number 2, focusing on wellness, not just illness. The third pillar is that whole culture change piece. And let me explain what this is to me. Culture change is kind of a fuzzy word, and I think it's really been diluted. I think lots of people say we're doing culture changes. It's gotten so it doesn't mean much anymore. So let me explain my feeling. Doesn't matter whether you love what I'm saying or not, or some other philosophy of care. If you take a wonderful new way of looking at dementia, a wonderful new way of caring for people with dementia, and you bring it into an institutional environment, it will die every single time. Because institutions are systems that are created to maintain the status quo. That's how we keep ourselves from getting in trouble. But it also is how we keep ourselves from changing. If you want new ideas to take hold, you have got to find ways to ingrain them into daily life and daily operations. And that, to me, is what this culture change is all about. It's about transforming care systems to embrace new ways of thinking and new ways of acting. You can tell your aides that you're going to be person-centered now, and the person's more important than the task. But if your system says you've got to get 10 people up in the next 15 minutes because the breakfast trays are coming, it doesn't matter what you say about being person-centered. It ain't going to happen, because that person's job is still telling them they have to focus on tasks instead of people. So when I talk about transforming a care environment or a living environment, there are really 3 different ways we do it. Number 1 is the personal way. We change the way we look at aging, look at dementia, change the way we interact with each other and with the people we care for. The second is the physical dimension. We create living environments that are more reflective of the values of home, not the values of an institution or a hospital. And once again, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on with housing. But it doesn't matter. You can have a beautiful holistic mindset, and you can have a beautiful building, but if you don't change the operational systems, nothing happens. And so I've learned in my time that the most important leg of that stool is really changing operations, and that's where most people get bogged down. They have all the platitudes about being person-centered. They have a beautiful building, but nothing changes inside the building. And so operations is a lot of things. It's how you make decisions, who's at the table when decisions are made, how you empower people, whether it be staff, residents, families, how you resolve conflict, how you collaborate. It even gets down to things like job descriptions and performance evaluations. The author Upton Sinclair once said, it's hard to get a man to understand something if his paycheck depends on his not understanding it. And once again, how you evaluate people, what you measure people for doing, has to reward the kinds of actions you want to see, not the old way of doing things. And when there are regulators in the room, I don't know if we have any, but I remind them that if you survey homes to tasks instead of people, then you won't see change either, because that's what you're paying for. So it's up to every part of the system to start to shift the way we think and the way we act. And that is absolutely critical if you want any of this to happen. And that's why I remain devoted to this, not in the fuzzy way. It's not just a matter of having a bird in a cage next to the receptionist's desk. It's about really rolling up your sleeves and getting into the nitty-gritty and saying, how are we going to truly change this system so we can do things differently? And what I'd like to do is just leave you with one story that takes kind of these fuzzy things here and puts them in a way that shows how they can impact quality of life, quality of care, and for the CFOs in the audience, the bottom line as well. I'm going to introduce you to my dear friend Dan Greenwood from Australia, Daniela Greenwood. Deke thrilled me by telling me that when they do their person-directed care initial training for all employees, they start with a beautiful 15-minute video that Kathy Greenblatt made of Daniela's group, Our Care Australia. Daniela lives in Australia. It's just 10 years ago this year that she left the music business and decided to go volunteer in a nursing home. 15 years ago, she was doing a national tour as the opening act for Elvis Costello, so she had a very different kind of life. But she got tired of the music business, went to volunteer in a nursing home. It led to an activity degree that led to working at Our Care, which is now 29 communities around South and East Australia, and working her way up to being what is now called the Strategy and Innovation Manager for this whole corporation. And just when I was meeting her about 4 years ago, she contacted me because of my writings. She had just started a project that the two of us like to call dedicated staff assignments. Now we talk about consistent staffing or permanent staffing, but we like the word dedicated because it really suggests that there's some intent behind the relationship of who we care for. She was asked by Our Care to bring their service to the next level. Once again, they were a highly viewed for-profit organization in Australia, but they didn't want to stop there. So they said, go out there and find the next thing for us. So she did a survey, an appreciative survey of 80 elders, family, and staff, and said, what could we do to make things better? And she got all their comments and put them into 4 buckets. And the biggest bucket was one she called connections. It was all about connectedness. It was all about relationships. Relationships, kind of fuzzy, kind of kumbaya, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, people were saying that they wanted better relationships. And specifically, they wanted more consistency between the people who live there and their family members and those who are caring for them. The common practice around the world in nursing homes is to rotate staff. It could be once a month, it could be once every few months, but we tend to not stay in the same place. But she got comments from family members, from residents, and from staff saying the challenges that caused when they had to move around and work with different people. The lack of knowledge, the lack of trust, and particularly people with dementia who have memory loss already and have to get used to new people, new faces, new names, and have to be understood when they have difficulty communicating. And so she began a pathway for dedicated staff assignments. And the first thing she did was she gave staff education sessions for hands-on staff and for managers, so everybody could understand the importance of this. Then everywhere where people worked, where there were people living with dementia, some were dedicated living areas, some were integrated people with and without dementia, but wherever there was someone there with dementia, the nurses and aides had to reapply for their job. And to reapply for their job, they had to do 2 things. They had to commit to working at least 3 shifts a week, minimum, no once a month per diem. And number 2, working with the same residents every single time. Now you might think, well, what's wrong with 3 months? What's wrong with 6 months? How about once a year? What if we rotate staff once a year? I might ask the ladies in the audience, how often do you want to see a different gynecologist? Is once a year okay? How often do you want a different banker, a different lawyer, a different barber or hairstylist? If they have your records, they must all be the same, right? And how many different people do you want taking off your clothes and having access to your naked body? Is that really right? Is this really about the dignity of the people? And this doesn't just happen in nursing homes. I heard a friend of mine who's a BBC anchor up in Scotland wrote a book about her mother's Alzheimer's, and she interviewed a woman whose father lived at home with Alzheimer's, and over the course of a year, he had 106 different home health employees come into his house. So literally 2 strangers a week taking off his clothes. She went and filed a complaint with the National Health Service and said, I should have sold tickets because that's what it felt like with people coming in. So this is that stigma. This is this feeling like, oh, people with dementia are slightly less. They don't deserve the same kind of respect that you or I would demand for ourselves. So people had to reapply, and she used several things. She used a validated tool called the ADQ to help measure people's ability to work with people with dementia. They used interviews. They used supervisor evaluations, and they rehired the best people. And they didn't rehire the people that weren't the best. And Danielle says, you put your 11 best football players on the field every Sunday to win a game. Why don't our frail adults deserve that same commitment to quality? Why are we letting people who are sliding by work with people who don't need that kind of care? So she started one at a time, one community at a time. It took about 3 years to roll this out. And, because it was done slowly and gradually, but she was smart enough to measure outcomes too. It was about relationships, but more happened than just relationships. Here are some of the things that happened in those early adopting communities. Within 6 weeks, the first community said they were spending more time with the residents and they weren't sacrificing any completion of tasks. Some of the early adopting communities showed a nearly 70% decrease in respiratory infections. 70% decrease. A nearly 90% decrease in pressure sores. Now, why would respiratory infections go down? Because the average number of people on days and evenings in a month that touched a person went from 28 to 5. That's why. We're not spreading germs around. But she went on and she kept measuring things. She found 100% elimination of formal family complaints. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. She found a 6-pound average weight gain. She found 25% decrease in falls, 13% decrease in skin tears, and a 50% decrease in as-needed psychiatric medicine doses, even though they weren't following any specific initiatives to improve any of these outcomes. It was all by putting the same people with the same people. They found increase in family satisfaction, increase in staff satisfaction, big decrease in turnover, 50% compared to what their baseline had been. And now that they've rolled this out, they had 27, they've just added 2 communities, so she's constantly rolling this out. But at least in the first 27, as each of these communities have rolled this out, there has not been one formal family complaint lodged in any of these homes. Now, does that mean everybody's happy all the time? No. But what do they do if they're unhappy? They go to the team members with whom they have a relationship and they work it out. It never gets kicked upstairs anymore because there's a relationship there that wasn't there. So you can imagine what this has done for the quality of care. You can imagine what it's done for their financial bottom line. They're building new communities. They're full. They have a waiting list. They have 2,000 staff who are dedicated to the organization. And they won a national award from the Australian government last year, a Better Practice Award for doing this. So yeah, relationship sounds fuzzy, but this is what culture change is really about. It's about rolling up your sleeves and saying, let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's actually walk the talk. So I am grateful to be here with you today. I think I've given you enough food for thought. I could talk all day, but I think we want to get on and have some more social time. And so I thank you for having me here, and I look forward to speaking with you some more afterward. Thanks.